Do you play football?
No.
What do you do?
I don't know.
Yeah, well, your brother, Danny Shaw, could play football.
So, I've been doing a series here on YouTube closely analysing each of the characters from the film The Breakfast Club, and as that series is approaching its end, I thought it's smart to begin another one on another film full of other characters worthy of analysis. I want to talk about Stand By Me, specifically the character of Gordie Lachance today. I am a counsellor, as I probably wedged into the title. I think it's a worthwhile exercise to look at Gordie's psychology a little, why he behaves as he does, what it tells us about him and his feelings, his struggles, just hopefully understanding to a level we can empathise with, even if we've not all encountered similar experiences. If you don't know the film Stand By Me, it's based on a short story called The Body by Stephen King about 4 kids in 1959 who go on a journey out past the edges of their town to find the body of a local boy called Ray Brower. I don't think that spoils anything, although this video probably will at some point. Our main character and narrator is Gordie Lachance, the burgeoning writer among the 4 who several months earlier had suffered the loss of his older, successful, popular brother Dani. And so, whether realising it or not, this quest to find Ray Brower's body becomes wrapped up in Gordie's own internal quest to come to terms with the death of his brother. Normally, I like to start these videos by pointing out something small and not too obvious about the character's behaviour, but this time I think we're better to just begin with the context around his home life as we see it. In his own words, Gordie argues that he's become
the invisible boy
following the death of his older brother, to which we're shown his parents not just ignoring him as best they can, but seemingly going through little more than the motions of life, very passive and emotionally deadened here. To which you can say they seem a little stuck in the grieving process, neither able to move on nor to really mourn Dani either. Seen best in the example of Dani's room, kept like a shrine that the dad seems not to want anyone entering, as though doing so would alter and damage the space, ruin something that needs to be perfectly preserved in order to maintain Dani. I think for parents who do lose their children, making something of a shrine out of the bedroom is quite ordinary or common. Many different reasons people might do it really, but in this specific instance it seems to create a block. The parents aren't thinking or reflecting on Dani and their experience of mourning, they're just kind of maintaining this space outside of time passing. Having this shrine kind of spares them from having to think about it because they can put it into that room. Symbolically, it's kind of over there, tucked away into that neat box. That's fine, we don't need to think on it or process the feelings the way Gordie in part seems to be trying to in entering the room, thinking back over his interactions with his brother, trying to make sense of it all. I hope that doesn't sound like a criticism of the parents. I mean, it's obviously not great. You can't just pack away such a huge and traumatic loss into this neat box without processing it, but it's very, very difficult for them. Their purpose in life seems to have at least partly been geared towards their children, helping them grow, but particularly Dani, who is this popular, successful sports athlete, the hero archetype, I suppose, with the dad seeming to value sports above all other pursuits, perhaps wishing to live vicariously through Dani. But if that's been their purpose, once he's suddenly gone, they're stripped of it and left unsure what to do anymore really. And all of this is a problem of course for Gordie, not just because if his parents aren't processing their own grief, that makes them ineffective at helping to contain Gordie's feelings and helping him work through them, but it also places a lot of pressure upon Gordie's shoulders.
Why can't you have friends like Denny's?
We'll get to that second point later though, and how the difference in their opinion of Gordie compared to Dani affects things. For now, it's enough just to imagine how frustrating it must be for Gordie to want to grieve someone he cares about in a house full of people who won't allow it. To want to talk to someone about Dani, but when you do get chances, it seems not as a chance to express grief, but more as a moment to compare you against your older, shining ideal of a brother. There's no outlet at home. Just this sort of out-of-time dollhouse feel of a family who, resisting the death of their son, sealing him into this space where time doesn't pass, seem to have deadened themselves too. Dani may have been their parents' son, but he's also Gordie's brother. That's a huge, huge figure in his life that he's lost, and he needs to talk about him and to talk about his feelings of loss, but right now his parents appeared too stuck and pained to really be able to provide that care for him there. As I say, hopefully that's just part of the large grieving process they'll eventually find their way through. Dani only died several months ago at this point, so it is still fairly early on, but the other issue that we touched on is Gordie becoming this invisible boy, which I don't want to say is just because they preferred Dani, but that is how Gordie interprets it, so if that's how he feels, that's how it is to him. And it's not just Dani as the golden child where Gordie isn't, but it's also Gordie feels his parents resent him to some extent, as though he was supposed to die, not Dani. It's somehow his fault for not taking that place. Which may be what his dad feels, it may be Gordie's fantasy, hence the dream where his dad tells him,
Should have been you, Gordon.
but either way, true or not, it's a hugely powerful feeling to have. Logically, we know it makes no sense. Gordie wasn't even at the accident or anything. It's not like he could have even taken Dani's place if he wanted to. Not that that's the point. It shouldn't have been Gordie. It shouldn't have been either of them. No child is supposed to die, but this is a deeper feeling beyond rationality, and that makes it a difficult feeling to resolve. Gordie was half invisible when Dani was alive.
Dennis, when you're out there tomorrow.
Pop, did you read the story that Gordie wrote? Gordie wrote a story.
I see. That's what I'm talking about. Football takes concentration.
This non-sporty, more sensitive and creative, and I suppose what could have been seen as unmasculine in the 1950s. But now he's even more invisible because Gordie is proof that life has to go on. Looking and attending to his needs means attending to a future, or even just a present where Dani isn't around, and at that moment in time, the parents may feel attending to anything other than Dani would be like insulting his memory. Attending to the future feels to them like letting go of Dani's past, which is something they're not yet ready to do. Which is what I mean when I say there's an out of time sort of feel to this all. They're not able to think about Dani and to mourn him, nor to let him go and to focus on the future that is Gordie either, so they're trapped in this paralysed state between neither. And that makes for something deeply troubling for an 11-year-old boy that needs his parents the way any kid at times naturally needs their carers. So what are we left with? Probably a boy who does feel incredibly guilty about Dani's death, about being the one who is alive, even when he definitely shouldn't have to feel that.
It should have been me. Don't say that, man.
That, combined with this feeling of resentment from his parents, probably knocks his self-esteem quite a bit and leaves him in a position where he will say things like,
I'm no good. My dad said it, I'm no good.
I suspect there's also a great deal of anger towards his parents, particularly his dad, for not meeting his needs or giving him that space to talk about Dani, but instead of expressing any of it, he's just frozen into this sort of indifference about his dad.
I couldn't give a shit about my own dad, who hadn't laid a hand on me since I was 3.
And instead kind of turns that anger upon himself, fueling even more personal attacks about being useless and pathetic and telling himself he was supposed to die, which is sad. And then obviously there's the other more concrete feelings to do with grieving the loss of his brother, but I think we'll come to some of that later. I realise all I've really discussed so far is the context and content rather than character, but I think it's useful to imagine the difficulty it is for Gordie living in that home. I think it all makes his friends a very, very necessary escape from this kind of dollhouse. Not just to interact with people who aren't deadened and can energise him as we see they do in this film, but also just people to who he isn't invisible, people who remind him he does exist, and in Chris, somebody he can talk to about his brother, to express and work through all that grief. His friends are hugely beneficial in that sense, both a physical escape from his home and an emotional space to actually let things out. Seen most clearly, of course, in the fact Gordie is yet able to cry about Dani, but upon seeing Ray Brower's body, with Chris sitting beside him, he finally gets that space. Writing, of course, is his other very useful means of expression and working through his feelings. We don't see much grief in the Davy Hogan story, but no doubt he is writing other stories that some of his feelings about Dani are unconsciously explored within. This very quiet and reserved boy who keeps his head low and is withdrawn in his body language. A lot of sadness, a lot of anger towards his parents, possibly even his brother, all of it redirected at himself. All of this pressure building up that his writing is an internal kind of means to express and vent. If there's one thing his Davy Hogan story is definitely about, it's an expression of anger at the society of Castle Rock and general people in Gordie's world. It's a very clear middle finger and revenge to everybody, all vented in the typical, cartoonishly disgusting way that would appeal to kids. He can work through that there in an internal way, and his friends give him this external kind of means to express. He gets both, and with all this pressure inside him, that's massively important. Shall we get into Gordie's actual behaviour though, and some of the deeper conflicts we can find there? When the idea of going to see a dead body is first raised, we know from the narration and the anxious stillness of Gordie that it's not an idea he's keen on.
I wanted to share my friend's enthusiasm, but I couldn't.
You expect he would be anxious, whilst the whole weight of Dani's death is yet to fully hit him. The idea of a dead body, of course, still feels more real to him than to his friends. For Chris, Teddy and Vern, it probably feels like something out of a comic, to the extent they don't even consider what a dead body might look like until halfway through the film, and even then Vern's imagination appears to paint a cartoon image.
Like if he's really bad, like all cut up in blood and shit all over him.
Gordie, though, has very palpable reasons not to want to go on this trip, except rather than airing them, he gives an indifferent sounding response of
Sure.
Then appears to quietly sit there regretting what he's agreed to. It's left instead to Vern to raise all the reservations, and to Vern to be teased as the scaredy cat one of the group. At 11 or 12-ish sort of years old, this is of course an age at the very beginning of puberty, where you're in a strange tension between being boy and man, or what you imagine a man to be at that age, trying to find behaviour and emotion to match the physical and hormonal changes you're feeling to go through. This split is a very natural one between a tender, more anxious Gordie beneath the surface who cherishes writing, who seeks comfort from Chris, then this show of strength, I suppose, trying to not seem what they imagine to be weakness, where you get all the naturally childish insults on each other's mums, Gordie wanting to take shop classes instead of more academic ones that he suggests are for pussies.
You're gonna meet a lot of new guys. Smart guys. Meet a lot of pussies is what you mean.
Even criticising writing, his truest passion.
Fuck writing. I don't want to be a writer. It's stupid. It's a stupid waste of time.
I don't think it's at all uncommon for 11 or 12-year-old boys to try acting tougher than they feel. And I think whilst Vern is the go-to target in the group to take the mick out for being the least tough, I think Gordie feels, were Vern not there, Gordie would probably take that role. Thin, gangly, a much slower runner than Chris with a sensitive side he half embraces, half attempts to resist. Does the family setup with his brother make these pressures even stronger for Gordie though? Maybe. Dani, who was felt perhaps to be the kind of embodiment of everything masculine in this 1950s world, glittering athlete that Gordie is most definitely not. And so, when his dad values sports but not writing, is Gordie felt to be a disappointment? Possibly, but whilst Dani is alive, that's okay. Well, it's not great, but at least Dani himself seems to value Gordie's strengths and shows support to the stories he writes.
Dorothy, I don't know how many
I really
times
liked it.
I told you when I'm making
Thought it was great.
I don't want you
With
interrupted.
Dani there, Gordie not only has someone in his corner, but he's also allowed to be different. Sure, his father may be disappointed he hasn't lived up to Dani's example, but Dani himself has done that, so it's fine. Gordie doesn't necessarily need to. He has space to be someone else, perhaps hence picking a group of friends that are an opposite to Dani's shining hero archetype.
A thief and two thieves.
Which as a tangent is something all four friends do have in common, I suppose, feeling like the bad, disliked ones. So there's that, but when Dani's gone, suddenly that changes. Suddenly Gordie isn't allowed to be someone different, but is meant to take up Dani's mantle in order to honour his legacy, let's say. Suddenly all hopes are on him, and in failing to be like his older brother is seen like an insult to his memory.
It should have been me. Don't say that, man. I'm no good.
Which is horrendously painful. Not only are you losing a brother, but you're also sort of losing the right to live your life your way. Instead, trying to fill a void left behind, you become not your own distinct identity, but something to plug a gap. So, maybe some of this attempt to seem tougher and to resist his writing image is an attempt to be like his brother, to fill those shoes. Maybe. I don't think we see enough in this film to say with any concrete evidence. I think in Chris, who does have a sort of older brother role for Gordie, protecting, comforting and giving advice to him, I think despite his thief archetype, he half represents everything Gordie wants to be. Stronger, athletic, fearless, a leader. Everything Gordie feels he's supposed to be, for which we can't underestimate the brilliance of Chris to tell Gordie not to be like him, to be himself. For Chris to recognise Gordie's intelligence and creativity as a strength of its own to nurture. It's him who argues Gordie shouldn't take shop classes just to be with his friends and to distance himself from a nerdy image, and Chris is right to. Look, there's a point I want to raise because it's interesting and it does tie into what I've said about Gordie's anger redirected at himself, and it's just what the film made me think of while I was watching it. Perhaps because of the limited examples we see in an 86-minute film, this point doesn't fit Gordie fully. I think it does to a much lesser extent, not to the same extreme, but either way, the film made me think back to a paper I read years ago by Deborah Blessing called The Long Shadow, The Implications of Sibling Loss. And whilst it talks mostly in the context of eating disorders, the paper is about suffering the death of a sibling and how you can naturally feel a great sense of guilt for being the one who survives, and also a level of identification with them. Identifying with them perhaps in an attempt to honour their legacy, perhaps in a frightening idea of usurping their place in the family, perhaps just to keep the memory alive. Either way, there is a difficult question within the experience of losing a sibling at a young age. Central to the experience of those who have lost a sibling is the question of whether they have a right to exist. Can they dare to come alive, to become a separate experiencing self? Is Gordie allowed to strike into the world as the person he is, or should he become paralysed by the conflict between filling the space of his brother and being afraid to do so? Caught between trying to be like Dani but also worrying he'd be replacing his brother, for which he'd feel great guilt, and so ending up kind of frozen between the two. On one level, the answer he seems to be falling upon is that
Should have been you, Gordon.
that he doesn't have the right to exist, and so maybe not necessarily in the sense of literal death here, but internally and emotionally, he's now deadening himself. That's how his parents are, after all. Is there a little part of Gordie that seems to be doing the same? Many such patients appear robotic, as if occupying a nether region, poised on the edge of the dividing line between life and death. I think there is an argument to be made for that, but I also think it's a bit of a stretch. It's more like bending the material to suit a theory that in no way is meant to apply to every situation. Nonetheless, these questions do seem to be a part of Gordie's grieving process. Should it have been me? Is my dad resentful that I'm alive instead of Dani? What do I feel about that? Why did he have to die? Do I have a right to live my life? They're not really rational questions to find logical answers to so much as fantasies and feelings to make sense of. Hopefully that's what Gordie is slowly doing. Chris in particular proves a huge support there. There's a lot our parents are supposed to provide for us growing up, a lot we need and don't even realise they're providing for us, but in reality, often our parents aren't able to give us all of that for whatever reasons, and sometimes we have grandparents or people like that who can help out, and other times we've got friends. there when we need them most. Do I think Gordie found his way, if there's such thing as finding your way? Yes, I think showing us an adult Gordie kind of implies that. Half the point of this film is to reflect back not just on how difficult growing up really can be, but that we do, often hard as it is, find our way through. I think the fact we see adult Gordie apparently able to reflect back on and grieve Chris well enough to write a whole story about him suggests he did experience a healthy enough process of grieving Dani. Perhaps his friends, particularly Chris, was an essential part of that. This is actually only the second time I've ever seen this film, so it is quite new to me in a way The Breakfast Club wasn't when I started analysing it, and I haven't even read the short story yet. So as a result, I suspect there is a lot I've missed, a lot of blind spots too, particularly because Gordie reminds me a lot of my younger self. I think that makes it... it's harder to think clearer about people you relate to more. But that's fine, I'm never trying to create concrete videos with all the answers and full completed analysis of things. I kind of prefer leaving some gaps, and what I reckon it means is that this series will progressively get deeper with each video by virtue of it meaning I see the film an extra time and notice more, which I think did probably happen with the Breakfast Club videos too. If there's more I realise about Gordie, perhaps that'll come in at points during later videos, but for now I hope you enjoyed this, I hope you got something from it. Give it a like if you did, leave a comment if you have anything to add or anything I've missed or got wrong. Subscribe if you fancy that, support me on Patreon, stick around for more videos on the other characters, and of course the final video in my Breakfast Club series is to be done at some point, but otherwise, hopefully see you next time. And as ever, a special thank you goes to Devin, Kestrel, Arwen, Janice McMahon, Luke Orr, Chichu Kaber, Michael Gallagher, InSquares, Dustin Paulson, Samara Salsi, Sharikov2814, Joshua C. Follier, Chad Bramwell, Incomplete Sentience, and Nicholas Patrick. Thank you.